The night settles softly over the Atlantic coast. Waves roll endlessly against the dark rocks of Cabo da Roca, where the land of Europe ends and the ocean begins. In the hush of twilight, one can almost hear the whispers of sailors long gone, their voices carried by the wind that smells faintly of salt and pine. It was here, on this rugged edge of the world, that a small kingdom looked outward and dreamed of horizons beyond the setting sun. Portugal was never vast in land or number. Tucked between the mountains and the sea, its people farmed vineyards on stone terraces, cast nets into restless waters, and prayed in whitewashed chapels. Yet, from these modest villages came a daring spirit, a longing to know what lay across the horizon. The ocean was both fear and promise, a vast mirror where men saw not only danger but destiny. In the 12th century, as castles rose against the backdrop of Moorish wars, the Kingdom of Portugal declared its independence. From Afonso Henriques, the first king, to the merchants of Lisbon who traded silks and spices, the nation slowly shaped its identity, half warrior, half sailor. Faith guided them, but so did hunger for land, for trade, for a story larger than themselves. And so, when the age of discovery dawned, Portugal was ready. Its ships would carve new paths across the seas. Its captains would stitch together continents, and its empire would span from Brazil to India. For a time, Lisbon became the heart of the world, where caravels returned with treasures and tales that dazzled Europe. Yet every empire carries both triumph and sorrow. The same waves that bore riches also brought ruin, storms, wars, and rival empires would test Portugal's might. The glory that began with a whisper by the sea would one day fade, leaving behind ruins, songs, and echoes of journeys that changed the world. Tonight, let us fall asleep to the rise and fall of the Portuguese civilization, its courage, its beauty, and its inevitable surrender to time. Long before Portugal was a kingdom, the land at the edge of Europe was a crossroads of peoples. The Iberian Peninsula had seen Celtiberian tribes planting wheat on dry hillsides, Roman legions building roads and aqueducts, Visigoth kings ruling from crumbling fortresses, and Moorish emirs praying in whitewashed mosques. By the 12th century, when the name Portugal first emerged, this patch of land was already layered with centuries of struggle, faith, and survival. Life for the common folk was shaped not by kings or generals, but by the earth and sea. On the northern plains, peasants bent their backs to the soil, tending vineyards that would give birth to wines both humble and noble. Olive groves clung to hillsides, their twisted branches like ancient guardians of the land. Along the southern rivers, Moorish irrigation channels still carried water into fertile fields, leaving behind the wisdom of Arab engineers long after the warriors had departed. But it was the sea that gave Portugal its soul. Fishermen rose before dawn. Their small boats pulled across damp sand, nets heavy with the hope of sardines, cod, or mackerel. Children watched from the shore, learning early that the ocean was both provider and thief, bringing food one day and storms the next. Villages huddled against the wind, their white walls stained with salt. In the evenings, under lantern light, sailors told stories of strange lights over the horizon, of monsters in the deep, of treasures hidden far away. The kingdom itself was born from battle. In 1139, after years of fighting during the Reconquista, Afonso Henriques declared himself King of Portugal. Legend says he was crowned on the field, his sword lifted toward the sky, as if heaven itself had blessed his cause. Castles soon dotted the hills, their stone towers a symbol of fragile independence. Yet independence meant little without loyalty, and so the people clung to their king, their faith, and their land. Lisbon, perched on the Tagus River, grew into a bustling port. Markets overflowed with spices from Moorish lands, with fabrics woven in distant workshops, and with fish caught just beyond the mouth of the Atlantic. Here, Christians, Jews, and Moors traded side by side, their languages mingling like the tides. For a moment in history, Portugal felt less like a frontier and more like a window, half Europe, half world. Still, life was not golden for most. Taxes weighed heavily, and war demanded young men. The nobility feasted in their stone halls while peasants counted coins for bread. Yet, through hardship, a stubborn resilience formed. The people of Portugal became known for endurance, for a quiet strength that endured storms both earthly and divine. In the distance, beyond the horizon, the ocean whispered of lands unseen. Few dared to listen, for to sail too far was to risk never returning. Yet the whisper remained, growing louder with each generation. Though Portugal was small, hemmed in by Castile to the east and the sea to the west, it carried within it a restless spirit. That restlessness born of hardship, sharpened by faith, and tempered by the sea, would one day push this little kingdom toward greatness. As the 13th century closed, Portugal was still modest, a narrow land, its castles facing both Moorish enemies and Christian rivals. But in its harbours, sails fluttered in the wind, and in its villages, boys gazed at the horizon with eyes full of questions. The stage was quietly being set for a story that would carry Portugal far beyond the limits of its shores. In the centuries after its birth, Portugal was more than a kingdom of stone walls and fishing boats. It was also a frontier of faith. To the east and south, Moorish strongholds still glittered with minarets and gardens. To the north, Castilian knights pressed against the border. The Portuguese lived at the edge of Christendom, and in that borderland spirit, religion and survival became inseparable. Every village had its chapel, small and white against the hills, where bells rang not only for prayers but also as warnings of raids or storms. Life followed the rhythm of the church calendar feasts, fasts, processions, and the yearly pilgrimages that carried peasants along dusty roads toward holy shrines. Faith was not distant or abstract. It was in the bread they ate, blessed by the priest. It was in the cross carved over the door to guard against misfortune. It was in whispered prayers before men set sail, entrusting their families to God's mercy. Among the nobility, faith wore another face, the Knights Templar. Later absorbed into the Order of Christ, carved fortresses into the landscape. Their Red Cross banners fluttered over high walls, symbols of both defense and devotion. These warrior monks were not only protectors but also dreamers, believing that conquest could be holy and that wealth gained from war could be sanctified by piety. From their estates, resources would one day fund ships and voyages, linking the crusading spirit of the Middle Ages with the coming age of exploration. Lisbon itself was a city of mingled worlds. Merchants crowded its port with goods Moorish silks, Castilian grain, African ivory. Its streets echoed with many tongues: Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and the rough dialects of sailors. The Jewish quarter bustled with scholars and traders, whose knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and navigation quietly fed into Portugal's growing ambitions. Yet, tolerance was fragile, for the fires of faith often burned hotter than the needs of trade. For ordinary families, the frontier meant both opportunity and fear. Land taken from the Moors was given to settlers willing to farm and defend it. A poor man might rise by courage on the battlefield, while others perished in obscurity. Women tended fields, raised children, and kept households alive while their husbands rode south with the king's banners. Each victory added another stone to the kingdom, but each loss threatened to unravel what had been so painfully won. The Portuguese imagination grew in this soil of faith and frontier. Legends of Christian heroes, saints who fought alongside knights, and miracles that turned battles into triumphs shaped the national soul. But beneath these stories lay the quiet endurance of farmers, fishermen, and artisans. Their toil made possible the castles of lords and the prayers of priests. By the 14th century, Portugal had found a fragile stability. The Reconquista was nearly complete, and the kingdom had secured its independence against Castile. But this hard-won peace did not still the restless spirit of its people. To live on the frontier was to grow accustomed to risk. And when the frontier on land was finally closed, their eyes turned naturally to the sea. Faith had taught them to believe in what was unseen. The frontier had taught them to survive where danger lurked. Combined, these two forces, faith and frontier, would prepare Portugal for its leap into the unknown. Soon, the kingdom would look west and south, not for battles of swords, but for journeys of sails. The story of Portugal cannot be told without the sea. It was not just a border. It was a calling, an ever-present horizon that lured hearts and tested courage. For centuries, fishermen had known its moods: the calm mornings when sardines filled their nets, the sudden storms that swallowed boats whole, the fogs that rolled in like ghosts. To live in Portugal was to live with the ocean as both neighbor and master. By the early 15th century, the sea was no longer enough. As a provider of fish and salt, it became a promise of wealth and wonder. Europe hungered for spices, pepper, cinnamon, Cloves that traveled slowly and expensively along overland routes controlled by Muslim and Venetian traders. To break that monopoly, someone would have to find another way. In Portugal, the answer seemed obvious. Sail south, hug the African coast, and perhaps, someday, reach the Indies by water. At the heart of this vision stood a Prince Henry, later called the Navigator, though he rarely sailed himself. Henry gathered sailors, cartographers, and shipbuilders at his court in Sagres, a wind-swept promontory where the land juts into the Atlantic. There, under a sky of stars, men studied the heavens and learned to read the sea. They experimented with caravels, small and swift ships with triangular sails that could tack against the wind. To many villagers, they looked fragile. To mariners, they looked like freedom. The lives of sailors were hard, and yet they went willingly. They were peasants' sons. Drawn from fields where hunger gnawed, they were second sons of nobility. With no land to inherit, they were dreamers who longed for more than the narrow valleys of home. On deck, they sang to keep time as they hauled ropes, whispered prayers as waves crashed over the bow, and carved saints' names into the wood for luck. At night, lying on planks beneath the stars, they wondered if the world ended just beyond the horizon. Fear was their constant companion. The ocean was rumored to hold monsters, serpents with jaws wide enough to swallow a ship, waters that boiled near the equator, and winds that could never be escaped. Yet curiosity was stronger than fear. Each journey farther down the African coast brought new discoveries, strange birds, new stars in the sky, islands rising from mist. Sailors returned with gold dust, ivory, and tales of lands where the sun seemed to burn hotter than fire. Henry's dream was not merely commerce but destiny. He believed Portugal had been chosen to spread faith as well as trade, to carry the cross and the crown together into uncharted waters. The Order of Christ, successor to the Templars, funded many voyages, its red cross painted proudly on the sails. Every expedition was both a gamble of profit and a prayer of salvation. For the people left behind, the sea was both pride and sorrow. Wives and mothers stood on the shore, watching sails shrink into the distance, uncertain if their loved ones would ever return. Some never did. The ocean claimed men silently, leaving only widows and unanswered prayers. Yet, with each return of a battered ship, its hold filled with treasures and stories, hope grew stronger than grief. By the time Henry died in 1460, his vision had taken root. The Portuguese had sailed beyond Cape Bojador, once thought impassable, and had touched the edges of lands that Europeans had never seen. What began as cautious steps had become a path into the unknown. The call of the sea had been answered, and Portugal was no longer just a small kingdom on the edge of Europe. It was becoming a gateway to the world. The caravels that slipped out of Lisbon's harbour in the 15th century carried more than sailors and provisions. They carried ambition. Each journey south along the African coast was a step further into mystery, where maps faded into blankness and rumour filled the void. To the common folk of Europe, Africa was a place of fables, lands of gold, rivers of gems, monstrous beasts, and kingdoms ruled by priests of fire. For Portuguese sailors, it became a reality of heat, danger, and opportunity. The early voyages hugged the shoreline, for sailors feared the endless deep. They learned to read the rhythm of winds and currents, the Canary Current sweeping southward, the trade winds driving them farther along the coast. They touched at islands Madeira, the Azores, the Cape Verde archipelago, planting sugarcane in volcanic soil and bringing goats and grapevines to lands uninhabited. These islands became both refuge and experiment, miniature colonies where the lessons of empire were first rehearsed. Along the African coast, encounters were cautious and uneven. At trading posts, Portuguese sailors offered cloth, iron, and beads. In return, they sought ivory, pepper, and above all, gold. Guinea's rivers glittered with the dust of that precious metal, and Lisbon soon felt its glow. Coins minted from African gold bore the cross of the Order of Christ, a reminder that commerce and crusade walked hand in hand. But another trade took root in shadows. At first, it was a small exchange, captives taken in raids or purchased from local rulers. These men and women were brought north, forced to labor in fields or homes. As sugar plantations expanded on Madeira and later São Tomé, the demand grew. Slavery, once an incidental prize of war, became a system of profit. For the Portuguese crown, it was another thread in the fabric of empire. For the captives, it was the tearing of lives apart. Life on the African frontier was harsh even for the conquerors. Sailors endured fevers in sweltering climates, storms that smashed ships against reefs, and loneliness on long stretches of coast where no friendly port awaited them. Fortresses were built at Elmina in present-day Ghana. Others scattered along the Gulf of Guinea, stone outposts against a vast continent. From their battlements, Portuguese soldiers stared inland at forests they dared not penetrate, content to let trade come to them. For Lisbon, the wealth was intoxicating. Gold and pepper poured into its markets, and the kingdom's coffers swelled. Merchants spoke of fortunes won in a single voyage, in the taverns by the docks. Returned, sailors told of elephants that marched like armies, and of kings who ruled cities larger than any in Europe. Their tales were embroidered, yet they carried the scent of truth. Among ordinary Portuguese, Africa was both fascination and fear. Songs and stories painted it as a land of marvels and dangers, where fortune awaited the bold but death stalked the careless. Parents warned children not to wander too far into the waves, lest the sea carry them to Africa. Yet ambition drew more and more men to the ships, each hoping to carve his own fate from distant shores. By the end of the 15th century, Portugal's African enterprise had become a highway of trade stretching thousands of miles. The crown grew stronger, Lisbon richer, and the vision of reaching India by sea grew closer. Still, each voyage left questions unanswered, each discovery hinting at more. Africa was not an end, but a passage, a long road that wound toward the unknown riches of the East. And so the Portuguese pressed on, steering their caravels around capes and currents, listening to the sea as if it whispered secrets only they could hear. Africa had opened its gates partly by welcome, partly by force, and Portugal had stepped inside. Yet just beyond the horizon lay the greater dream. Shimmering like a mirage, the spices of India. By the late 15th century, the horizon of Portuguese ambition stretched far beyond Africa. Gold and pepper had enriched Lisbon. But the true prize lay farther east India, the fabled land of spices. For centuries, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg had traveled overland through the Middle East into Venetian markets, each transaction multiplying their cost. Whoever reached India by sea would hold in his hands the wealth of kingdoms. In 1497, Vasco da Gama set sail to attempt what no European had achieved. His fleet of 4 small ships left Lisbon amid prayers, bells, and the tears of families left behind. They rounded the Cape of Good Hope, where mountains plunged into stormy seas. Here, waves smashed against cliffs like thunder, and sailors clung to ropes with bleeding hands. Convinced they had reached the edge of the world, yet the caravels endured, climbing waves like mountains, sliding down into foaming valleys. When da Gama's fleet crossed into the Indian Ocean, they entered waters that carried centuries of trade. Arab, Persian, and Indian sailors had long known these routes. Guided by the monsoon winds, to the Portuguese, each new coastline shimmered with strangeness, mosques with pointed minarets, markets heavy with scents of cardamom and saffron, rulers whose wealth dwarfed that of Iberian lords. In 1498, da Gama reached Calicut on India's Malabar coast. There, he found not a land eager for European goods, but a sophisticated world of merchants who had little need for wool, iron, or glass. Spices were abundant, but access was tightly guarded by networks of Muslim traders. Still, da Gama returned to Portugal with enough cargo to ignite a fire in Lisbon. He had proved the route was possible. The dream of reaching India had become reality. Soon, fleets poured into the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese built fortresses at Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz, each a stone anchor of power. Cannons thundered from their decks, for they did not merely trade, they seized. Merchants who refused to deal with them found their ships burned, their ports blockaded. To Lisbon, this was victory. To many in the East, it was intrusion. Goa became the jewel of the empire, a place where Portuguese officials governed Asian subjects, where churches rose beside temples, and where the rhythms of Europe mixed uneasily with the songs of India. Malacca, controlling the strait between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, became another key. From these strongholds, Portugal sought to master the flow of spices, channeling wealth into the Tagus River like a golden tide. But empire was not only steel and profit. For sailors and settlers, life was harsh. Diseases struck in tropical climates. Storms destroyed fleets. And loneliness gnawed at men far from home. Letters took months, sometimes years, to cross the seas. Many never returned, yet they left behind children, blending Portuguese blood with Asian, African, and island peoples. Out of hardship, a new, mixed world was born, stretching from Brazil to India. Lisbon, meanwhile, transformed. Its markets overflowed with pepper and cinnamon, once treasures. Now, daily goods. The scent of spice drifted through alleys and taverns. Wealth dazzled the nobility. But inequality deepened. Palaces grew more ornate, while peasants still bent their backs over fields. The city was becoming the hub of a global empire. Yet it carried within it the seeds of imbalance to India and beyond. Portugal had sailed, carving its name into the oceans. What began as the dream of one prince had become a network of forts, fleets, and markets spanning half the globe. And yet, with every victory, the empire made new enemies, sowed new debts, and stretched itself thinner. The seas had delivered triumph, but they whispered too of storms yet to come. While Portuguese ships carved paths across Africa and into India, fate granted them another prize, unexpected, vast, and fertile. In 1500, a fleet commanded by Pedro Alvarez Cabral, blown off course on its way to India, sighted a green coastline rising from the Atlantic mist. He called it Terra de Vera Cruz, the land of the true cross. Later, it would be known by the name of a single tree, Brazilwood, whose red dye would color the fabrics of Europe. At first, Brazil was little more than an afterthought. The riches of India dazzled the crown, and Lisbon's gaze remained fixed eastward. But slowly, the promise of the new land drew attention. Its forests seemed endless, its rivers wider than imagination, its soil rich enough to yield crops unknown to Europe. Here, a new chapter of empire began, one that would define Portugal's destiny as much as spices and gold. The first years were marked by contact with indigenous peoples. They fished the rivers, hunted in forests, and tended small gardens of manioc and maize. To the Portuguese, their lives seemed both simple and abundant. At first, the exchange was cautious, iron tools and beads for Brazilwood and food. But soon, as settlers arrived, the balance shifted. The crown divided the land into captaincies, granting nobles the right to govern and exploit. Colonial life had begun. Sugar was the key. European markets craved sweetness, and Brazil's climate proved perfect for the crop. Vast plantations rose along the coast, worked not by Portuguese hands, but by laborers forced into bondage. At first, settlers enslaved native peoples, but disease and resistance made this unsustainable, and so began the grim import of African captives, shipped across the Atlantic in chains to toil in fields under a burning sun. Brazil became both wealth and wound a jewel for Lisbon. a sorrow for those who labored unseen. For ordinary settlers, life was harsh. Men hacked at forests that seemed to grow back overnight. Women kept fragile households, balancing Portuguese customs with the realities of a new world. Children grew up speaking words from many tongues: Portuguese, Tupi, and African dialects, blending cultures into something new. Out of hardship, a hybrid society emerged, rich in rhythm and resilience, yet scarred by division. Lisbon rejoiced in the profits: sugar, tobacco, and later gold poured into the royal treasury. Ships returned laden with wealth, their holds creaking under the weight of empire. Yet the distance was vast, the cost immense. Defending Brazil against French and Dutch raiders stretched Portugal thin. Governing its immense lands required more than decrees, it required settlers, soldiers, priests, and endless sacrifice. For the people of Brazil, life was a paradox. In the forests, indigenous tribes still lived beyond the reach of Portuguese control. But closer to the coast, the rhythms of Europe mixed with African drums and native chants. Churches rose beside palm trees, and processions wound through settlements where slaves carried crosses alongside masters. Suffering and splendor existed side by side, inseparable in the fabric of colonial life. By the 17th century, Brazil had become Portugal's most treasured possession. Its sugar fields outshone the spice trade, and its size promised endless resources. Yet this blessing carried its curse. Brazil consumed Portugal's strength, drawing men, ships, and gold across an ocean that seemed both bridge and abyss. As the sun set over the Atlantic, Portuguese families in Lisbon might sip sweetened wine or taste sugar cakes, scarcely imagining the lives that made them possible. In Brazil, beneath the same stars, slaves bent in fields, settlers dreamed of fortunes, and indigenous peoples watched forests fall. The empire had crossed into a new world. But at its heart lay the old truth: every gain carried a hidden loss. By the 16th century, Portugal stood at the zenith of its power. For a brief, dazzling moment, this small kingdom on Europe's Atlantic edge commanded an empire that stretched from Brazil to Africa, from India to the fabled Spice Islands, and as far as distant Japan. Its ships wove a web across the seas, carrying gold, ivory, spices, sugar, and silks into Lisbon, transforming the city into the beating heart of a global exchange. Lisbon became a wonder to travelers. Its quays were lined with caravels and galleons, their sails patched from storms, their holds bursting with treasures. Merchants haggled in dozens of tongues: Portuguese, Arabic, Gujarati, Malay, even Japanese. In markets, pepper was weighed like gold, cinnamon scented the air, and fabrics from Asia gleamed in colors that dazzled European eyes. The wealth of continents poured into narrow streets where donkeys brayed under loads of spice sacks and nobles' carriages splashed through mud. For the nobility, this was a golden age. Palaces rose with tiled courtyards and painted ceilings, Banquets overflowed with exotic flavors, pineapples from Brazil, nutmeg from the Moluccas, and sugar so abundant that it sweetened even humble dishes. Scholars translated Arabic texts. Sailors brought back stories of new worlds. And mapmakers charted coastlines that stretched farther with every voyage. Lisbon was no longer a frontier, it was the first global city. But beneath the splendor lay shadows. The wealth of empire did not flow evenly. While nobles and merchants grew rich, peasants still plowed stony fields in the north. Their lives little changed from centuries before. Many never tasted the spices that enriched their lords. For sailors, empire meant peril. Thousands vanished in storms or from fevers in tropical ports. Their names were forgotten, though their sacrifices built the empire's glory. In colonies, life was harsher still. In Brazil, sugar fields consumed endless lives. In Goa and Malacca, Portuguese garrisons ruled over local peoples. Mixing violence with conversion, priests preached the gospel, yet often stood beside soldiers who fired cannons into resisting towns. The Red Cross painted on sails carried both faith and fear across the seas. Rival powers began to take notice. Spain, richer and larger, envied Portugal's monopoly. The Dutch and English, rising maritime nations, studied Portuguese roots and prepared to challenge them. Already, Dutch raiders stalked the coasts of Brazil, and English privateers hunted treasure ships in the Atlantic. Portugal's empire, vast but thinly stretched, carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. Yet in Lisbon, the glow of triumph remained. Festivals filled the city with processions, music, and fireworks. Churches resounded with choirs singing in thanksgiving for victories abroad. At night, sailors gathered in taverns, telling tales of islands where birds shone like jewels, or of Japanese warriors who bowed with swords gleaming in torchlight. To ordinary listeners, these stories seemed half dream, half truth. Portugal had become greater than its size should have allowed. Its courage, its ships, its restless spirit had carried it farther than any kingdom of its age. But like a flame burning too brightly, the empire consumed itself with the very brilliance that made it extraordinary. For now, though Lisbon basked in the height of its power, unaware that storms both political and natural waited just beyond the horizon. Empires rarely fall in a single blow. More often, decline arrives like dusk, slowly, softly, until the brilliance of day fades almost without notice. For Portugal, the 16th and 17th centuries marked the lengthening of shadows. What had once been a daring expansion across the seas began to fray under the weight of rivals, war, and exhaustion. The first cracks came from abroad. The Dutch and the English, long students of Portuguese navigation, launched their own voyages. Armed with powerful fleets and driven by merchant companies, they challenged Portuguese strongholds from Brazil to the Indies. One by one, forts that had seemed secure fell under siege. Malacca was taken, spice routes diverted, and Dutch ships prowled the Atlantic like wolves. The monopoly that had enriched Lisbon began to break apart. At home, the kingdom strained under burdens it could not bear. Too few in number, the Portuguese had stretched across oceans, leaving garrisons thin and colonies vulnerable. The wealth that flowed into Lisbon dazzled but deceived. Gold and spice enriched a narrow elite, while the common people remained poor. Fields in Portugal itself lay neglected, for men sailed abroad chasing fortune, leaving villages hollowed and weary. The union with Spain in 1580 deepened the shadows. For 60 years, Portugal's crown was joined with its larger neighbour, and its fate tied to Spain's wars. Dutch and English enemies now saw Portuguese possessions as fair targets, and colonies once loyal to Lisbon grew restless under foreign rule. Though independence returned in 1640, the damage was lasting. Rivals had seized key ports, and the empire's grip on trade was slipping away. Lisbon, once vibrant with the scent of cinnamon and pepper, grew quieter. Merchants still traded, but profits shrank. In the taverns, sailors spoke more often of defeat than triumph, of voyages ending in storms or ambushes. Some dreamed of Brazil, now the crown's most precious jewel. But even there, French and Dutch raids threatened security. The empire felt less like a triumph and more like a burden. For ordinary Portuguese, decline was not measured in lost colonies but in daily hardship. Taxes rose to fund distant wars. Families sent sons to fight in jungles they would never see. Widows and orphans multiplied. In villages, church bells tolled for men who had vanished overseas, leaving only silence at empty tables. The wealth of empire seemed to slip away before it touched their lives. Yet not all was darkness. The Baroque age brought splendor to Lisbon's churches, where gilded altars and painted ceilings testified to both faith and ambition. Missionaries still carried the cross into distant lands, and Portuguese words echoed from Africa to Asia. The empire endured, but it no longer commanded the seas. The age of discovery had given way to an age of competition, and Portugal's small size left it vulnerable in a world of giants. By the end of the 17th century, the glow of Portugal's golden age had dimmed. Its ships still sailed. Its colonies still produced. But the shadows were undeniable. Rivals pressed harder, debts grew deeper, and the restless spirit that had once driven caravels beyond the horizon now seemed trapped in memory. The sun had not yet set, but the twilight had begun. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, the faithful of Lisbon crowded into churches. Candles flickered, bourgeois sang, and bells rang across the city. Then, just before 10 o'clock, the earth began to roar. The ground shook so violently that stone walls crumbled as if made of sand. Towers toppled. Roofs collapsed onto worshippers. And narrow streets split open. In a matter of minutes, Lisbon, the proud heart of empire, was reduced to rubble. But the horror had only begun. From the sea came a sound like thunder, and within moments, a massive wave surged up the Tagus River. The tsunami swallowed ships, hurled them against quays, and swept survivors into the churning waters. Those who fled to higher ground watched in terror as fire consumed what the quake and wave had spared. For days, flames devoured the city, turning its treasures, palaces, and libraries into ash. Tens of thousands perished. For Portugal, the earthquake was more than a natural disaster. It was a wound to its soul. How could such destruction strike on a holy day? Priests called it divine punishment, while philosophers whispered that it was chance, not providence. Across Europe, the event shook faith and reason alike. Voltaire wrote bitterly of Lisbon's ruin, questioning a world where the innocent died beneath church stones. The empire, already weakened, staggered under the weight of this calamity. Lisbon had been not only the capital, but also the gateway of trade. Its warehouses held spices, gold, and sugar. Its docks bustled with fleets. Now, much of that wealth lay buried beneath rubble. Though the Marquis of Pombal led a bold reconstruction ordering, bury the dead and feed the living, the kingdom's strength never fully recovered. At the same time, Portugal's colonies pressed forward. Brazil, with its vast mines of gold and diamonds, became the crown's lifeline. Ships sailed across the Atlantic carrying riches to rebuild Lisbon. But dependence on Brazil made the empire fragile. In Africa and Asia, Portuguese strongholds shrank as Dutch and English rivals dominated trade. What had once been an empire spanning oceans was now a patchwork, held together more by memory than by power. For ordinary people, decline meant struggle. Taxes rose to fund rebuilding. Soldiers marched to defend distant lands. And hunger visited villages when trade faltered. Still, the Portuguese endured with the quiet resilience that had always marked them. In Fado songs sung in Lisbon's taverns, sorrow and hope twined together like melodies of the sea. By the 19th century, the empire's unraveling was clear. Brazil, the jewel of the crown, declared independence in 1822. Without it, Portugal was reduced to a European backwater, clinging to fragments of Africa and Asia. The great caravels of the past were only memories, their sails folded forever. The earthquake had been both symbol and catalyst, a moment when nature revealed the fragility of empire, when glory collapsed into dust. Portugal would endure as a nation, but never again as a world power. The fall of Lisbon's towers echoed across centuries. Empires rise with daring and fade with time. But in Lisbon's ruins, the truth was carved in stone. Even the grandest visions must bow to the earth itself. After the earthquake and the loss of Brazil, Portugal entered the 19th century with a shadowed heart. Once master of oceans, it now struggled to keep even its fragments of empire. Wars swept across Europe. Napoleon's armies marched into Iberia, and Portugal became a pawn in the games of greater powers. British troops defended Lisbon, and Portuguese soldiers bled in foreign fields. Independence had been preserved, but pride was wounded. The 19th century brought waves of change. Brazil's independence stripped Portugal of its richest colony, leaving only scattered possessions in Africa and Asia, Angola, Mozambique, Goa, Macau, and Timor. These lands, far away, were held more by inertia than by strength. Steamships and railroads shrank the world, and Portugal's small fleets could no longer compete with British and French empires. At home, life was marked by poverty and resilience. In the countryside, peasants still tended vineyards and olive groves as their ancestors had for centuries. Fishing villages lined the coasts, their boats rocking gently at dawn, their nets cast into waters that had always been both generous and cruel. In Lisbon, narrow streets echoed with Fado, songs of longing and sorrow, sung in smoky taverns where sailors and workers gathered. This music carried the memory of lost empires, yet also the endurance of a people who had learned to survive loss. The 20th century brought dictatorship. António de Oliveira Salazar rose to power in the 1932, preaching discipline, austerity, and tradition. For decades, Portugal lived under his rule, isolated from the modern world. While Europe rebuilt after war, Lisbon remained quiet. Its streets shadowed by censorship and fear, the empire lingered. But only barely. In Africa, independence movements grew, and colonial wars drained Portugal of lives and treasure. Then, in April 1974, the silence was broken. Soldiers carrying carnations in their rifles filled the streets of Lisbon. The Carnation Revolution toppled the dictatorship without bloodshed. Crowds sang. Flowers bloomed in gun barrels. And a nation long suppressed breathed freely again. Within years, the colonies were gone, and Portugal turned inward, choosing democracy over empire. In the modern age, Portugal found a new place. It joined the European Union, rebuilt its cities, and embraced its seafaring heritage not as conquest but as culture. Tourists wandered through Lisbon's tiled alleys, stood beneath the arches of Jerónimos Monastery, and listened to Fado drifting from cafes. Portuguese became one of the world's great languages, spoken in Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, and beyond, a living echo of empire that had once stretched across the seas. For ordinary families, life today is gentler than in centuries past. Children run along beaches where caravels once set sail. Fishermen still mend their nets, but their catch is smaller, their tools modern. Farmers still tend vines, pressing grapes into wines that travel across the world. The sea remains constant, eternal, whispering of journeys and dangers past. The empire is gone, but its memory lingers. In the flavors of codfish, salted as it was 500 years ago, in the blue and white tiles that tell stories on Lisbon's walls, in the sorrowful notes of Fado, where history is not forgotten but sung. Portugal may no longer rule the oceans, but it endures as a nation of memory, beauty, and resilience. Empires rise and fall. What remains are people, their songs, their stories, their courage, and in Portugal, at the far western edge of Europe, the ocean still stretches endlessly westward, as if inviting once more the daring spirit that changed the world. Night falls again on the Atlantic coast. The tide rolls in, washing against the cliffs of Sagres, where Prince Henry once dreamed of worlds beyond the horizon. The caravels are gone, their sails folded forever, but the wind still carries whispers of their journeys. If you stand quietly, you may almost hear the creak of timbers, the cry of gulls, the murmur of sailors speaking of spices, gold, and distant lands. Portugal's empire has long since faded. Its forts in Asia stand as ruins. Its colonies have become nations, and its ships rest at the bottom of forgotten seas. Yet the story endures, not in power, but in memory, in Brazil's language and music, in Angola's rhythms, in Mozambique's poetry. The echo of Portugal still lingers. An empire of stone has vanished, but an empire of words and culture remains. For the Portuguese themselves, history lives in daily life. In the Fado songs sung in Lisbon's taverns, sorrow and longing flow like tides. In azulejo tiles that cover churches and stations, stories of saints, battles, and voyages shimmer in blue and white. In the taste of salted cod and sweet pastries, one can sense the legacy of oceans crossed, of worlds once joined. What does it mean, this rise and fall? Perhaps that greatness is not measured by wealth or armies, but by endurance. Portugal was small, yet it dreamed greatly. Its people were few, yet they carried their language, their faith, and their spirit across the globe. Empires may crumble, but dreams outlast stone. As the stars appear over the Atlantic, the lesson is gentle and eternal. No empire lasts forever, but no journey is ever truly lost. The sea remembers, the songs remember, the people remember, and so, tonight, let us close our eyes to the story of Portugal, a kingdom born on the edge of Europe, lifted by courage, carried by the sea, broken by storms, and reborn in memory. Empires rise, empires fall, but the waves continue, their endless rhythm, whispering softly to those who listen, lulling us into sleep.